Hey YouTube, welcome to All Ends. Full review of Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown. Eric and I sitting here having a review discussion, talking about probably I would say January's biggest game that released so far this year. The first big game really of 2024, I would say.
In the Nintendo landscape, absolutely.
For sure. Well, and like I played through it for carpool gaming. A little while ago I did the review. You can find that on the channel. But now that Eric's had a chance to play it, we're finally getting a chance to sit down and really kind of chew the fat on this. So, if you've never joined us before for an all-in review, there is a bit of a ritual to it, and we're gonna let y'all know how we do things here. So, first of all, we don't issue any numbered scores. Sorry, Metacritic / OpenCritic, we don't do that. We're just gonna talk about the game, give you our full, honest thoughts on it, and let you decide from there. We think that video games are too complicated to boil down to a simple, number, 7 out of 10. 5 out of 10, whatever. We're just going to talk about it and let you decide from there. And we also like to structure the reviews in terms of segments. So we are going to talk about the narrative of the game. We're going to talk about the presentation, the music, and finally the gameplay. And that is for not only ease of listening and ease of talking about it, but just to keep us in check, because otherwise we'll just go all over the place.
We will. We absolutely will. We've done it before. We'll do it again.
Yeah. So there's a lot to get into here with this one. Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, the first new Prince of Persia game in 14 years.
Yeah.
It's been a long time. So I maybe even like because people kind of know my relationship with Prince of Persia, but I don't know if you've ever really talked about where you come at with this.
Well, I played in, kind of soft air quotes, played the original Prince of Persia game
Mm-hmm.
back in the late 80s and early 90s on what passed for a personal computer at the time. And even on, I think I actually played one of the OG console versions. And if you've never played one of the OG Prince of Persia games, those games are stupid hard. Those games are incredibly difficult and unforgiving. But weirdly, when the reboot came out in 2002, my friend Garrett picked it up and he played it. And I don't know what it was about watching him play the game, but there was something about watching him playing the game that I just did not think it looked good
Mm.
whatsoever. As a matter of fact, I gave him quite a bit of flack while he was playing it, to the point where we had one of our rare fights about it. But weirdly enough, I would eventually play the game myself, and I was like, I'm so sorry. This is amazing. This is so good. And I wound up playing through the entire Prince of Persia trilogy that came out in the 2000s: Sands of Time, Warrior Within, and I was about to say the Lost Crown, the Two Thrones.
Yeah.
The Two Thrones. I will say I did have an issue that kind of reminded me of a few things. I had one of my most vivid gaming memories from that entire part of my life is getting to the final boss of Warrior Within and having it glitch on me and not
Oh.
actually being able to fight the final boss. So I still love Warrior Within. It's still an amazing follow up to Sands of Time, but I do that is a memory I think will be forever solidified in my brain. But I never wound up playing the weird Xbox 360, like, wasn't it Nolan North
Yeah.
voiced version of the Prince? I never wound up playing that, nor the 3DS game that I wasn't even aware of that had spawned until recently. But it is still one of those franchises. Again, Jordan Mechner, who has gone on to become an industry legend. So when Ubisoft said they were reviving the franchise and kind of going back to its Metroidvania roots, and we're going to be following a new character, this new character named Sargon, I was incredibly excited. The first trailer that was shown off looked incredibly hyped. The action looked incredibly fluid and interesting. It had this really comic booky style, really colorful, really contrasting art style that I really dug, and we'll talk about here in a few seconds, I'm sure. But I was incredibly excited for this game, and the thought that we were going to be getting a triple A Metroidvania here in 2024. Something I genuinely thought we would never see again until we wound up getting Metroid Dread a couple of years ago, a game that has been compared to death already to
Mm-hmm.
Prince of Persia, The Lost Crown, something that I'm going to try not to do too much necessarily. However, we do still have to talk about how good the game is. This is, in fact, a review discussion.
It is. Yeah, so I guess let's like we are wont to do, let's kick things off by talking about the story of the game. You
Mm-hmm.
mentioned Sargon. Sargon is one of the Immortals, which is a group
Persian
of
Justice League.
basically, yeah, like they essentially are the Persian Justice League, the Persian Avengers. However, they're superheroes
They
basically, and
really
they
are. I mean, the way they're introduced in the
yeah.
story, the way they're brought in, the way they're shown off, these ungodly powers that they have compared to mere mortals, the way the game presents them essentially is as superheroes.
Mm-hmm.
And especially with the incredibly flamboyant art style of the game, that was immediately, especially with the big superhero group pose that they
Yep.
strike right toward the beginning, I was like, oh, it's Persian Justice League. Okay, got it.
Straight up, yeah. And what's cool about this game's story is they pull a lot from actual Persian mythology, which the
Mm-hmm.
the series hasn't really done all that much until this point, which is really cool. And the Immortals are plucked straight out of Persian myth, as it turns out. And I didn't even realize that until after I'd
I
played the
didn't know
game.
that.
Yeah, the Immortals are real things in Persian myth, and so that's really neat. And the game does that in a few ways. You know, it's funny. Longtime All N fans might remember the Manticore, which is also apparently has its roots in Persian myth. The Manticore is a Persian creation, and I had no idea about that until playing. There is a Manticore in this game,
Mm-hmm.
and so you know, that piece of it is kind of neat. But anyway, Sargon is one of these immortals who are these kind of sworn protectors of Persia. Persia also has this sort of like bird god of time called the Simurgh, who has
Yep.
been not seen or heard of in some 30 years. You know, there's a new sort of like queen that has taken over after the mysterious death of King Darius. And you know, you're not playing as the Prince of Persia in this. Sargon is not the Prince of Persia. The actual Prince of Persia, his name's Hassan, gets kidnapped right away in the
Mm-hmm.
beginning of the game. And effectively, you have to follow the kidnappers to Mount Kaf, which is also a real place in Persian myth, and figure out what's going on there. There's time shenanigans happening there, just like any Prince of
Oh,
Persia
yes.
game.
Oh,
And
yes.
yeah, you got to rescue the Prince of Persia and uncover the mysteries of Mount Kaf,
Yeah.
basically.
I will say there are a few twists and turns in the tale, which we are absolutely not going to spoil for you. But I don't really consider myself somebody who is adept at really sniffing out a lot of those plot twists.
Mm,
That being said, a lot of the ones that occur within the first half of the game are like, bro, I saw that a mile away.
sure. Yeah.
Um, and unfortunately, when it comes to the narrative, the trailers and a lot of the marketing for it has also kind of revealed and kind of spoiled a lot of that as well, unfortunately. Um, I don't want to, in case you might be wondering what some of that is, I don't want to elaborate on that to try to keep whatever narrative whatever narrative you were able to keep unspoiled from in this game. I would never do that, but it I don't know. Some of the back half stuff that happens, I was like, oh, okay, that's not bad. I see where you're coming from with that. But I mean, ultimately, it's a fun story. My biggest issue with it is there are way too many characters. There are
Mm,
absolutely way too many characters in this game. You could have easily taken 3 or probably even 4 characters out of this title. There were a couple that show up toward the end of the game that I was like, oh, I completely forgot you were even in this title.
yeah.
Completely forgot you were even in this game. But I mean, ultimately, enough stuff pops up that justifies the existence of most of the characters to kind of remind you of why Sargon is doing what he's doing, the path that he's on, and his motivations. Because admittedly, Sargon himself, I think, is a good character. I
Hmm.
think he's played very well. The vocal performances, I think, are really solid throughout for this game, which does go a long way toward toward investment in in the narrative and in the story. And I do think Sargon especially is played in a very nice three-dimensional way. You have this young man who does have a touch of arrogance, but there is also humility to him. He's not just this one-dimensional braggart who needs to go on this hero's journey. There is already depth to Sargon, but not enough so that he can't have substantial character growth throughout the course of the story. So I do think from the perspective of just the main character, I think Sargon is handled well. And by the end of the game, I was interested to see where his story goes from there.
I agree. I like Sargon a lot, actually. And the thing that's a bummer is like the game sets up like some theming. It's trying to say something about there's this whole like what is at the end of your blade,
Yeah.
It's trying to set up like what are you fighting for, like what what is your actual motivation, what do you actually want out of your
With
life,
great power and just
that sort of thing. Yeah. And like the game never really like gets into that too much at the very end. There's like a little at the very, and I do like the way the game ends.
yeah, the ending sequence is pretty rad, actually. I do appreciate the ending sequence.
I do too. Yeah, and I was like, okay, like they were cooking something here, but like it literally, it's like they touch on that at the beginning and the end, and that's it.
Yeah.
Letters A and Z are the ones that matter, and everything else in between is just kind of set dressing to justify the gameplay, really. And that's fine because it's a Metroidvania, and like, it is a gameplay forward thing. But I almost wish that they'd sprinkled in like a little bit more throughout the course of the story, because I like the Immortals a lot too. Considering that not all of them get a lot of screen time, because of the vocal performances, like you're saying. And by the way, the voice cast of this game is like basically all unknowns.
Yeah.
Which I thought was great. I really
I do too.
was impressed by that. I was like, man, I don't recognize anybody in this cast.
I like to think I'm pretty well attuned to, the who's who of the current voice acting landscape. And even I was going through the credits like, I got to follow these people on Twitter or something. I don't know who in the world they are.
I like that. Like it's always cool when like an unknown, cast like that can really, and they're all great. Like they do a great job.
It worked out incredibly well for the new TMNT movie that came out last year.
Yeah. So I always love that. And, and I think that for what we have, the characterization is pretty good. I like the relationship that Sargon has with a lot of these immortals. We just, the game never really spends that much time with them. So, there is that.
Ultimately, I think at the end of the day, Sargon is handled very well. There were too many characters, but the characters that are there do a decent job of playing enough off of Sargon to help flesh him out, to help us get to know him better. And again, by the end, I was interested to see where his story went. But ultimately, there could have been some tightening up along the script writing process. But those are my thoughts on the game's narrative.
Yep. So let's talk about presentation. Like you mentioned before, the game's got a very comic booky sort of art style. I think very reminiscent of what we saw out of Ubisoft with Immortals Phoenix Rising.
That's a good point.
Tapping into that, quite a lot. And the cool thing about this, when it comes to the presentation, because they are doing this kind of more comic booky stylized thing, it makes the game extraordinarily scalable. Like, just like Immortals Phoenix Rising, like this game runs great wherever you're going to play it, including the Nintendo Switch, which is where Eric and I both played it. So like they've really allowed themselves like a lot of breathing room to make this stuff work. And I appreciate that a lot about this game.
Yeah. I mean, it's something that I've said, God, how many times at this point, but if you're attempting photorealism, that's never going to age well, just based on the technology of the day. Style and art direction over photorealism any day, in my book. I mean, there are some games that really do benefit from that type of style, but again, they don't age well, in my opinion. Whereas there are very stylized games from years and even decades ago that still hold up just because of the striking art direction. And from my perspective, I do think that even though the Nintendo Switch version of the game culpable to the other versions, to the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Series X. There were certainly times where I did notice the Switch effect, where the Switch was pretty noticeably trying to keep up
Sure.
with the game, trying to keep up with the visual fidelity of the game. Not to say that it ever really lagged behind too far in that regard, and the game still does look great. But in 2024, I do have to say that there were a couple moments where I could see the Nintendo Switch bleeding through just a tad when it came to the visuals, but that's about it as far as the actual intended presentation. The environments, I think, for the most part, are handled very well. I specifically really like the menu system and the AI. It's got this
Mm.
very arcadey style feel. It seems to me that there are so many bland menus out there that I really appreciate when developers actually take the time to make even something like the menu screen look even remotely interesting and remotely exciting. You know, I think even something like that is a really good indicator of just the overall amount of work that goes into a title personally. But one thing when it comes to presentation that I'm absolutely going to say is the environments go a long way toward your vibe and your feel and your immersion and your experience when playing a title. I'm just going to go ahead and throw this out there because I think this is the best place to put it. This game does have one of, if not the coolest areas I've ever played in a video game.
Hmm.
Good Lord. There is one area in this game specifically toward the back half of the title that is just mesmerizingly amazing. And you know exactly what I'm talking about, Seth.
I do, yeah. It's funny. When I was Ubisoft sent along like a review guide when I was reviewing it for Carpool, and they specifically were like, "Don't talk about this section." So I had to
I
talk
don't
about
blame
it,
him.
and I don't blame them either. And so I don't want to spoil you. When you play the game, you will know exactly where we're talking about. It is that striking. It's a breathtaking area. Just the whole conceit of it is just so cool and well done, and like what they get out of it, that to me is classic Prince of Persia. Like I love it when Prince of Persia can take its like core conceit and really make it bleed into like the level design. One thing about the 2010 Prince of Persia movie tie-in game, very kind of generic whatever game, but it had a really cool gameplay idea that I've never really seen used quite the same way before, and that is you could freeze time just like you can in a lot of Prince of Persia stuff. Time is always a piece, and they would use like there would be like busted like pipes or something shooting out water, and you could freeze time and use them as like pole vaults, like you could grab onto them and use them for the platforming. And like if there was a waterfall, you could freeze time and run along the water, and like they always do such a cool job of using the environment like to their advantage. And this game does that in many of the areas. One of the early areas that you get into is like this verdant forest with these mushrooms that you have to shoot to create platforms that are on like a timer.
Mm-hmm.
Like they keep ramping that up all the way through to the end. You of course have your like sand environments. This is a Prince of
Of
Persia
course.
game, right? But even the way they contextualize that is really cool, because like not only does it become in that moment like a weird little like pseudo platformer where you're having to like kind of move up and down the sand, but then they add like these caterpillars that can like break the environment. And it's really neat what they've done like visually here. I've seen a lot of people sort of like write this off as being bland or generic, and I completely disagree. I think that they have done some really cool things with the biomes in this game. That's an important piece of a Metroidvania. You got to have a great, memorable set of biomes, and I think this game has it.
I do think that some of them just kind of feel like the stock areas, like the temple area, the
Sure.
underground area, the fire area. But I am always going to remember this game's water area.
Mm-hmm.
That was just amazing. But
Yeah.
I I do have to talk about a few big things, and when it comes to the performance of a game, this is kind of also where we tie that in. And I've got to say that I'm glad that you didn't have a lot of the issues that I did playing through the game, but I did personally experience frankly, a lot of bugs when I was
Mm,
playing through the Prince of Persia: Sands of Time. When I was playing through the Prince of Persia: Lost Crown. I
yes.
apologize, Prince of
Yeah.
Persia. Sorry, I used the Sands of Time and went back in time for a second there. I apologize. Um, but I actually had 3 separate soft locks on the game that required me to like I couldn't even go into the menu. I straight up had to home button restart the title. 2 of them were specifically after pretty hard encounters or missions that
Mm,
made me groan pretty deeply at the thought of having to redo them after having functionally finished them.
yeah.
So that was admittedly really annoying. I actually had there's a when you get to kind of like the core map of the game, there's a pretty lengthy cutscene that plays that kind of introduces the area. The first enemies pop up. When I made my way back around, it actually replayed the cutscene when I got back to that area. So like that was weird. I ran into a lot of weird visual bugs. Those weren't necessarily game breaking. I did get hit by dead enemies on several occasions, and I think I may have to talk with you on offline about this. I think I may have just not triggered a boss fight that I was supposed to.
Hmm.
So I ran into some weird stuff that did admittedly put an overall damper on the experience, and I'd be remiss if I didn't mention just how many issues I did in fact come across. Again, Seth didn't deal with a lot of these issues, so maybe it was just my digital copy of the game or my Switch running it for whatever reason, but they were parts of the game, they were parts of my experience, so I've got to share them.
Wow. Yeah, no, that's definitely the most sort of like bug riddled account of this game that I've heard. Now, I did encounter bugs.
Yeah.
I did not have like a perfect experience. I've got, 2 treasures specifically that are bugged out for me, and it's
Yeah,
keeping
yeah,
me
you
from
did tell me about
100%ing
that.
the
Yeah.
game. So like that's unfortunate. And then Sean Capri from Carpool Gaming, like I was there when he was doing it. He had a boss soft lock on him twice, and he had to redo the fight a couple of times, like in
Yeah.
the middle of the fight. So like the game needs a patch, that's for sure. The game needs work. I think like you had mentioned before, like the Switch does have like some little slowdown issues from time to time. For in my experience anyway, they were very occasional. Like
Yeah.
I had them, every so often when things were really busy or something, but for the most part, the game targets like full 1080p 60, and in my experience, the game for the most part hit it almost all the way through.
Yeah.
And I did play through the demo on my PS5, and I was surprised at how close the Switch version is. Even
How
though
much parity it has? Yeah.
yeah, like even though the PS5 version, is obviously going to be a little prettier, and it has like the other versions of the game can go up to actually 120 frames a second. And like so you can feel that, but like the whole time I was playing it, I was like the Switch version is like not that much worse, you
No.
know. And bugs, like I said, bugs are persistent. Sean played it on PC. There are other people in the community who've played it on other platforms who also have experienced bugs. So like the game does need a patch. There's no bones about that. But yeah, overall, like the game is still playable. I mean, your mileage may vary.
No, absolutely.
So yeah,
Yeah.
we'll have to see how it lands for anybody who plays it, because you had a way worse experience than I did. But
I did, but so ultimately my thoughts about the presentation are, understandably mixed. I do like the art style. The game is going to age very well because of it. There are some, kind of Switch version, slight issues here and there. I did run into some major bugs. Uh, but honestly, after everything, after the game has had time to sit with me, the biggest takeaway is still just how striking that one area is. Even
mhm.
if I take one memory away from this game, it's going to be that area, which was an incredibly positive experience for me. It was just so, so cool.
It's
So,
so good.
yeah,
Yeah.
even amongst all of even the few major issues I dealt with, I still came away with an overall positive experience on that aspect of the game. But those issues did exist. But moving into the game's soundtrack, uh, I specifically didn't watch. I specifically haven't watched anybody else's accounts of the game. I've specifically not watched anybody else play the game. So I don't know what anybody else, I don't even know what you think of the game's music up to this point. So I'll be very interested to hear what your thoughts are on it now.
Yeah, I like it. I think it's good. The lead composer of the game is Gareth Coker,
Mhm.
who people probably know best from the Ori series. He's worked on a bunch of other stuff since then. Mario Rabbids. He was one of the three composers on
Yep.
Sparks of
That's
Hope.
that's what I was going to
Um,
say. That's probably what a lot of people would know him from, is being like the other guy in and amongst Grant Kirkhope and was it
Yoko
Yoko
Shimomura.
Shimomura?
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, so like they so he's the lead composer, but he also worked with an Iranian musician named Mentrix, an independent Iranian musician named Mentrix, who really added a lot to this game. They deserve a lot of credit for what they've added to the game, and this game has got, and we've talked about this on our show before. Especially in like a sort of high action game, it can be really hard to make ambient music stand out. And it can be really hard, like in big moments, in boss fights, in combat, when like the guitars kind of coming in, taking off and stuff. That will slap you in the face a little bit. Yeah, like that'll get it done, right? But there are moments like, for example, the hub of the game, the Haven,
Yeah.
has got almost no music at all, and like that was a little weird to me. Like, and when I went through and I listened to the soundtrack separately as its own piece, I appreciated it more than I did in the moment, because it gets so lost among everything else. It's actually unfortunate that the game is not, like, on one hand I can appreciate it as like a separate work, but I don't know that it finds its place in the game as strongly as I wish it would, because I think it is good enough to deserve to be like one of the highlights that you talk about. But I don't think it ever quite jumps to the fore and slaps you in the face very often, you know?
I think a lot of that does actually have to do with the fact that, the game can be pretty challenging. The game
Hmm.
forces you to pay attention to it. The
Yes.
enemies, if you lose track of them for even a second or you mistime a parry or something, you can find yourself in a very bad way in a combat situation. This game forces you to pay attention to the gameplay and what's going on. So I do think that's a big reason for why I think a lot of people just like have a hard time, or may have a hard time, really picking out individual musical pieces, or have a hard time remembering the score from the game whatsoever. I did specifically notice that point you made about Haven's kind of
Hmm.
non-soundtrack, about its relative lack of a theme.
It's the hub of the
Um,
game. Like, it's
yeah,
where you go back there. You would think it would have a strong melodic core. In the video review I did for Carpool Gaming, like everything, like what you're saying is true. Like, it definitely is hard when you're focused on the gameplay elements of it, but it's also like lost in the actual like mix of the game, because I had to go in and like artificially increase the volume by like 90% to just illustrate what I was talking about in the video review. It's like quiet. Like, it's way in the background even of the mix, let alone the fact that it is, that it is a more ambient soundtrack in a game where you have to focus, so it's not doing itself any favors, unfortunately, because the music's good, you
yeah.
know.
And I want to say the vibes that it gave me, or maybe it was just the fact that I was playing a Prince of Persia game, but I want to say, like, that kind of Arabic is like, oh, yeah, yeah,
Sure.
something you'd hear like the old Brendan Fraser mummy movies, or, any type of action movie that's going to take place in and amongst a desert or mountainous region, that kind of, tribal, endemic, uh, uh, that folksy almost tinge to it. I want to say that that was, the atmosphere that I was getting from the
Hmm.
music. But again, I was trying not to die most of the time, so I did the just in order to talk about the music briefly here in a review. I was like, stop killing me for a second. I've got to figure out what's going on with the track.
Right. Yeah, but I mean, like, even in some of the more memorable areas of the game, I don't know that it necessarily has got memorable music to those areas. You know, like I'm not here to sit here and compare it to Metroid Dread every step of the way either. But one of the areas that I think Metroid Dread does like stomp this game at is atmosphere.
Yeah.
And like the music's a part of that. Not only like does Metroid Dread have some incredible backdrops and like the way that you can like see the
This,
bosses before you get to
yeah.
them and stuff.
The sound design also goes a very long way in
Yeah.
Metroid Dread, and I think the sound design, frankly, is just kind of okay here.
Mm-hmm.
The enemies have their little growls, their little exclamations. You have a big iron door that opens, and you hear a big iron door creak.
Mm-hmm.
So I think like the music is kind of muted, and the sound design, it does what it needs to do, but the sound design didn't really strike me as being, exceptional.
Right. And that can really elevate, you know, that can take you pretty far.
Yeah,
Because like the game in other ways I think excels and really innovates in the genre. We'll get into that. But like that I think is an unfortunate it unfortunately holds the game back from being like, you know, just like on another level, you know. So that's a bit unfortunate, but otherwise, like if you listen to it on its own, it's really good. And I like that. Yet again, we mentioned this with the voice acting. Like Mentrix is like a not well known composer or musician at all. Gareth Coker is, but Mentrix is not. And I love that, you know, they sort of shared the load a little bit on this. Like I don't know what they're at now. I'm sure it's higher now, but before the game came out, I looked them up because I saw their name in the credits, and they had like 1,000 followers on Instagram or something like that. You know, so like this is as indie gets. You
yeah,
know, it's like an Iranian like experimental metal musician. You know, and I don't know. I love that. I'm very here for that, but I wish it was more in the fore.
yeah. Fair enough. I think those some that sums up our feelings on the music and the sound design fairly well. I mean, there's nothing really of note left to talk about in this game, is there? I
Yeah.
think we've really touched on everything. You've got the narrative, the presentation, the music. Those are really the only elements of interactive entertainment. There's really nothing else to talk about. And of course, I'm going to stop being an idiot. Seth, let's get into the gameplay.
There's a lot to talk about there. Where do you want to start, man? There are more facets to the gameplay here than I think you would expect, and I think this is where the game really sets itself apart.
Well, I agree with you, and at the same time, I don't, but I'm interested to get into that conversation. But I think a good place to start is just by saying this is a Metroidvania.
Mm-hmm.
And people who are familiar with the genre, fans of the genre, will immediately see a lot of the tropes and a lot of the elements that come with this genre. You've got the backtracking, you have this big map that you're trying to fill out, you have these waypoints that you're trying to hit. A lot of the things that you would expect to be in a game like this, as a matter of fact, the vast majority of the things that you would expect to be in a Metroidvania are here. And any fans of the genre, I think, would be able to jump right in and be comfortable with the overall feel of the gameplay. This wasn't trying to necessarily reinvent the Metroidvania wheel. I'm just happy, again, that we got a AAA Metroidvania in 2024. But as Metroidvanias go, this is a pretty pure example of it, in my opinion. So just getting that out of the way in terms of setting expectations for what people can look forward to jumping into this game. For some people, like honestly, that was all I needed to hear. And I'm sure for a lot of people, just saying it's like, oh, it's a Metroidvania, and a lot of the things that you would hope to see in a Metroidvania are here. Cool, bro. I'm in. But yes, if you want to dig a little deeper into the surface, there's certainly a lot of fat to chew on. So, I mean, let's start with the combat. Let's start with how you actually kill the people, how you punch them in the face, because I think for a lot of people, that's always going to be the most interesting aspect. The exploration, the puzzle solving, those are all elements that are here. But I do think for a lot of people, for a lot of gamers at both the casual and hardcore levels, the combat is going to be what people are most interested in hearing about in terms of, how it works and the nuances that they can expect. And the game intentionally, I think, keeps some elements simple, but
Hmm.
at the same time takes those elements and gets about as much as you possibly can out of them. I was a little surprised to see that you only get one set of core weapons throughout the course of the entire game. Sargon has these dual swords that you never really lose. Those are going to be your primary weapons throughout the course of the game, and there is only one attack button that uses them. That being said, you go through a couple of this game's combat missions and you learn there's actually quite a bit of variety with these short swords, and ultimately with the different abilities and the different attributes and extra attacks that you'll unlock throughout the course of the game. Because while those twin swords are going to be your primary source of dealing damage, they are obviously not going to be the only thing that does damage throughout the course of the game.
No, yeah, certainly not. Well, and while they what I really love about this game is there's a ton of hidden depth to the combat. The
Mhm.
combat has things about it that it never explicitly tells you that you can do. And what it creates is it creates interesting moments, like the first time that I did a slide and then attacked at the end of it and kicked an enemy into the air.
The upkick,
I
yeah.
said, "Oh, sick. Awesome." The first time that I, accidentally held the attack button and launched one into the air and did a combo and ground slammed, like I'm like, this is great. And there is a training mode in the game where you can go in and learn about kind of some of the hidden functionality.
Yeah. And
There's a
I would
character.
absolutely recommend doing that.
I would too. Not only do you get rewards for it, but I mean
Yeah, you
that
do.
like that is one of the ways that this game, like, I've never played a Metroidvania that has a training mode like that in it. Guacamelee has got like a little spot where you can learn like some of your basic combos and stuff, but
Yeah.
I've never played a Metroidvania that has a place where it's like, hey, like here is like the breadth of everything that you can do. Like in terms of what you can do with this game's combat, while you're not getting a ton of new weapons throughout the course of the adventure, like the abilities they take this like multi-pronged approach to the abilities that you get, where they are utilized in combat, they're utilized in puzzle solving, and they're utilized for traversal, every single one of them. And so something like, at a certain point in the game, you get an ability where you can like kind of store an item. Like you can kind of keep an item with this dimensional rift thing. Well, that's used for puzzle solving, because you can take an item, move it to another place, and blah, blah, blah. It's also used in combat because you can capture enemies, throw explosive items at enemies, even sometimes make enemies fight on your side.
See, yeah, the
And
whole point of capturing enemies is when you release them, you'll see this wonderful little blue glow in their eyes.
mhm.
Apparently, sending an enemy to the Shadow Realm makes them fall in love with you. So by the time you release them, they will fight to the death on your behalf. And it's kind of rad.
It's great. And like there are things that, can happen in like combat scenarios that, for example, there's going to be boss fights that will send out sort of like screen filling attacks.
Yeah.
It's like, well, how was I supposed to avoid that, right? Well, there are abilities that you can utilize in those situations that can help you avoid stuff like that if you know how to use them correctly. And the game is not ever going to explicitly tell you that, but it allows you the room to experiment and play around and find these applications and make them make sense for you. When you get your like grapple hook ability thing, that's not only used for traversal, it's used to pull enemies towards you as well, so like
You pull
they
shields off of enemies as
I
well.
love that. I
yeah.
love that, like, it continues. And another thing that this game does, I think, expertly well, is those abilities and the way they play into all of those different facets of the game. You will use your full suite of tools for the entire adventure. There's never a moment where you're like, oh, I don't really need that. Like, you're going to get use out of them constantly through the whole way. Nothing really fades into the background. I love that. It's so hard to design a game this way, and they've done it. And I was very impressed by that.
Yeah, the main twin swords that you're going to be attacking with, a lot of the attack variation comes. Listen, I'm not going to explicitly say that the combat designers of this game took direct inspiration from Smash Brothers just because the game just celebrated its 25th anniversary. But I did specifically tell you, I was like, dude, Sargon's moveset
Oh
would
yeah.
fit flawlessly into a Smash Brothers game
Mm-hmm.
because it's not just mashing the button over and over and over again. You're probably not going to get too far with a lot of enemies if you just do that. You have, if you hit down and the attack button, you can do a sweep, which can also knock enemies into the air, and you can continue a juggle combo. You can hit up and the attack button to not only do an attack above you, but also to launch enemies further into the stratosphere. And you can continue to do combos from that, running and doing an attack, dodging and doing an attack. They do get a ton of use out of that one attack button, and most attacks you can kind of freely flow into one another. And then ultimately, you do get a few other damage dealing tools that you can continue to kind of combo in to your melee essentially. Not to explicitly make another Smash Brothers reference, but you do wind up getting a long range bow weapon, which doubles as a chakram. I don't know what kind of weird transformative
Yeah.
power that one goes through, but you have a dual purpose bow and chakram, and you also wind up getting access to these really cool looking, really cinematic, over the top super moves that you can
Mm-hmm.
also implement within the game as well. So even though on the face of it you've only got swords and then you get a bow, the amount of combat, if you really want to get a lot out of this combat system, it's there. If you want to just be able to go through and mash with occasional defending, if you want to go through and do that, you can probably make do as long as you get good enough with the defense aspect of the game. But there is a lot there to get out of the combat if you want it. But speaking of the defense option, one of the things that makes this game so challenging, or could make this game so challenging for a lot of people, is the fact that the only defensive option you have in terms of directly blocking attacks, you do have dodges that frankly worked kind of inconsistently for me, but you do have a parry that you can perform with the ZL button. There is not an actual block you can perform, you can only parry defensively. So you better get used to doing that, because if you mistime a parry, like I alluded to a little earlier, you can find yourself in a bad way very quickly in a combat situation, because mistiming a parry actually leads to heavily increased damage from any enemy attack. So being able to master this kind of free form, very acrobatic combat style, in addition with timing your parries, learning the enemy's attack patterns. Every time you run into a new enemy, they're probably going to knock you across the floor a few times until you get down how their attacks work, how their timing works, and everything like that. But I don't want to directly compare it to a Souls game, but for a lot of people, I do think that's kind of short form for very challenging combat that ultimately, once you learn enemy timing, when to dodge, when to parry, and when to attack, that's going to be where you find your most success.
Yeah. Yeah. You have to learn that. Like you have to, get to grips and understand, those systems if you want to do well in this game. It's very, very important. And this is another thing that is lifted essentially wholesale from Metroid Dread. Enemies will have kind of powerful attacks that have like yellow
Yep.
sort of coating on them, so you know when you're setting up for parry, and that'll trigger this like big flashy kind of super parry that'll usually kill the enemy when you do it.
Yeah.
It's also like great for boss fights because that'll take out a huge chunk of health.
Yeah.
And those are
Also
kind of
really adds to the whole cinematic element of the
totally.
game.
Hmm.
Again, you talk about these comic book style cut-ins or cutaways, and you get this really big, really intense close-up of Sargon's face.
Yeah,
His eyes turn blue and he goes, "You roar!" And there's
always
this
cool.
big, yeah, it is
Yeah.
really cool.
Always cool. And then the enemies will sometimes do red attacks that cannot be parried but have to be dodged instead. And the game has, and this is another example of like the sort of, hidden depth of the game, like you can not only slide usually under like bigger opponents and stuff. You can, eventually you're going to get an air dash, so you can kind of dash over opponents if you press the right trigger, which is normally your like slide and your sprint and stuff like that. If you do it from a neutral position, he'll do kind of a backflip a little bit and kind of back away from combat. So, you do have to, and this is why, we mentioned the training mode earlier. I mean, really spend some time, getting to learn the combat, because there is a lot going on here, and I think that the more comfortable you get with it, the better you'll perform. And I will say too, this is maybe just the best place to talk about the game's accessibility options, which are like some of the best I've seen in any game ever. Because if you are somebody you're like, I can't do it. It's too hard. I can't do it. You can go into the accessibility options and you can customize almost everything about your experience. You can change the parry window and make it much more forgiving. You can make the enemies die in like a hit. You can give yourself extra health. You can even, when it comes to the platforming, just teleport past challenging platforming sections. I mean, to say nothing of like the incredible like contrast and colorblind options that the game has. It's really
puzzle hints, and
it's crazy. Like, it's so well considered. Like the accessibility in this game, I think, is one of there are three things that I really think set a new standard for me in the Metroidvania genre, and this is one of them, because a lot of people with not just this game but also something like Metroid Dread, like Metroidvanias kind of have this reputation for their difficulty that I think turns a lot of people off from playing them. And like the fact that this game gives you ways to break down those barriers, like it makes it so much more easily recommendable, because people can get in there and really tailor their experience. I love that. More of this, please.
Now, that being said, I would, recommend, if that's not something that does immediately turn you off. I was quite happy with the fact that I was actually getting killed by bosses, even by normal enemies, even at the beginning of the game. I mean, this is still a Metroidvania. By the end of it, you feel like a god amongst men. I mean, Sargon's an immortal anyway. I should feel like that. But I was very happy with the difficulty curve, even at the normal difficulty setting, of which I think there are 5. 3 specifically above the normal difficulty setting. So I would recommend, checking it out. If you absolutely despise challenging platforming sections, though, like Seth said, you can bypass those. If you're really not into the puzzles that the game has on offer, you can get a lot of helpful hints and not necessarily bypass them, but, you kind of let the game play itself in a few ways. But I will, I touched on the bosses. The bosses, I think, are a little bit of a mixed bag for me. There are a couple that I think are truly great encounters. There is a specific ice boss in the back half of the game that I love, that I think it's easily my favorite boss fight in the game, and I think it's one of my favorite boss fights of the past few years. The Manticore that you spoke of, I thought was really cool. Some of the boss fights in the game aired a little bit too far on the side of annoying, but overall, I did like where they were coming from with the boss fights. I think conceptually, many of them were well designed and interesting. They were multi-stage, against cinematic encounters that did have a lot to offer. So in terms of the bosses, which are, when you talk about any kind of combat centric experience, that is going to be something, a point of contention or a point of praise for most people, because those wind up being oftentimes many of the standout encounters of the title.
I love them. I think they're great. Now there are some that I'm like a little colder on, especially the game does a thing, and a lot of Metroidvanias do this, where they have like something that is couched as a big boss encounter, but then later on they're like standard enemies. Like that happens a couple of times, and those I think are a little weak. But the actual like the actual bosses that we get in here, I think are really strong. And there are a couple. I love the one that you were referencing. The fight in the ice area, I think, is great. The fight in the water area, I think, is also really great. The fights, like there's
I'd have a
there's
much better opinion of that one if that wasn't one of my soft locks.
oh yeah, that's unfortunate. Yeah, well, and like there's a fight. The fight that gave me the most trouble in the entire game was, and I'll try to speak vaguely. It's with the boss in the game that has the most like ranged options.
Oh God, he
Um,
zips around. It was
yeah,
would you just stay in one place for 2 seconds? Let me at least touch you.
it gets
Good
like
Lord.
some Kaizo Mario level screen filling stuff in that fight, but like I love that also. Like I really like that it stayed challenging and it didn't necessarily feel unfair. And something that I would also encourage people do, in addition to the accessibility options, we haven't touched on the amulets yet. The amulets are kind of like another thing that I think allows for a little bit of experimentation and individuality. So there would be, enemies or bosses that were like kicking my butt, and I would go on to my amulet at the whack whack tree or whatever and swap out for an amulet that would be better for that situation, And like I love that the game allows you to do that. It's got this collection of, I mean, dozens of amulets that you can collect in the world and equip. You can end up getting, I think, up to 12 slots for your necklace.
Something like that. Yeah, they're the equipable accessories within the game.
Mm-hmm.
And they have all types of different effects. They can increase the power of the arrows, increase the power of your melee attacks. They can decrease damage, decrease elemental damage. And they can do, you can get more. Like when it came to the super attacks that I briefly
Mm-hmm.
touched on, you need to build up power. Parries are actually a fantastic way to build up power for those super attacks. And there are different things that affect how much energy you get from stuff. There's all kinds of different equipable items. I do like how they're presented in the game. It's not just as like a bracelet or something that they say is attached to your arm. The actual visual representation is Sargon's like actual like Mr. T style bling that he wears around
Mm-hmm.
his neck, and it's a visual representation of the stuff that he's actually wearing. And each of the different amulets has a very distinctive look, and you can actually see Sargon's like neck dress essentially continue to get more and more filled out with new amulets, new abilities and stuff. So I do like how that was handled. And yeah, like you said, there's several different equipable effects and modifiers and buffs that you can add, just like in mini games like this.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no, because I don't know that I can point to many other Metroidvania games that do allow that kind of expressionism. I would watch Sean play, and he would play the game quite differently than I did.
Yeah.
His amulet setup was quite different than mine, and I always like it when a game allows you even just a little bit of player expression. When you're playing something like Hollow Knight or
Yeah.
Guacamelee or Metroid Dread or whatever, like everybody's playing those games the same way. And I like that this game gives you options. I would like to see them go even harder in the sequel. Like I want even more drastic, changes depending on what amulets I'm wearing. I would love to
Yeah.
see that. I would love to see double, triple the amount of amulets too. That would be great. But like, I love that it gives me that at all. It's
Yeah.
really cool.
I will say something that I won't say this is a criticism of the game, because this is something I thought might happen that didn't. But all the weapons, all the amulets, all of these different things that you can get in the game, you can also upgrade.
Right.
Uh, this wouldn't be a Prince of Persia game without a bunch of time shenanigans. And the way that those time shenanigans are represented is through this mirror dimension-esque, almost crystalline-looking dimensional rift that creates these little crystals. And in addition to being a representation of different time-based powers, you also collect these crystals as the game's currency. There are like several different currencies within the game that, I don't think they necessarily needed to do that, but the main core currency is going to be these little time crystals that you find all over the map that enemies drop and stuff like that. And you can use them to upgrade your weapons. You can use them to upgrade the amulets as well. And I did think initially, because of the way the person who does a lot of this upgrading, they're presented in a very elemental fashion.
Sure.
So I did think that maybe you'd be able uh, to upgrade, augment, or maybe change the element or change some of the properties of various things,
Be
various
cool.
amulets. So if we do get a follow up to Sargon's adventure, I do think that would be a nice way to continue to allow players to further customize their experience. Okay, cool. You've got an amulet that grants you extra attack power or something. Let's buff it with this extra effect that I can also get to, kind of further synergize that. But that's not in this game. Not a knock against that whatsoever. But
Sure.
you can augment basically any of the items that you can equip within the game to
Yeah.
some pretty stunning effects. Once you get to the end of the game and you've got everything buffed out and upgraded and everything, it is one of those things where you just start zipping through and laying waste to everything in your
I
path.
love that. I love that, like that the game has a really good like power scale. Like you really do ramp up your power, your abilities. And yeah, you talked about the current, there's I guess 3 currencies in the game technically.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's like a collectible like ore. There's not that many of them. You find them in the world. Or they can
Yeah.
be a quest reward or whatever when you do some of the
Yeah.
side quests in the game. There are these Xerxes coins, which are basically strawberries from Celeste. You
Basically, yeah.
yeah, you see them kind of floating in the world, you get them, and then you need to like safely land basically to actually collect them.
Yeah.
So I
That
mean, like,
winds up being the challenge most of the time. Is
yeah,
there a lot of those are specifically put in places to where like half of the challenge is getting there and the other half is getting back out.
yeah. So
But
I
I don't mind that.
no, I love that. I like that. You know, there are a couple of collectibles in this game that are kind of whatever, like just lore collectibles.
There's a lot of stuff to collect in this game. I mean, it's a Metroidvania, and because it's got a AAA budget behind it, this map, like I said at the beginning, this game wound up being bigger than I thought it was going to be. This
Mhm.
is a pretty meaty map, which means there's a lot of stuff to see, do, and fill your pockets with. So if you want 100% this game, A, we need a patch Ubisoft, but B, it's probably going to take you a few hours.
Yeah, I mean, I was kind of having to rush through the game a little bit for
Yeah.
review. So I ended up around 70% completion when I rolled credits, and I was I was like 21 something hours when I rolled credits with 70% completion. That said, probably my biggest gameplay centric complaint, the game's annoying to 100%. It is like they don't have enough tools in place for you to go through and figure out exactly what it is that you still need. They're, you know, the lore collectibles that are kind of scattered throughout the map, unless you have an accessibility option turned on to highlight them, they can be hard to actually see or know like what I've picked up and what I haven't picked up. So like that can be annoying. In addition to that, while there is an amulet that you can get that has like this parrot bird follow you around that can squawk when you're near something,
I think that
there's
was part of the deluxe package specifically.
okay, yeah. So I had that the code they gave us was for that. So I had that little parrot thing, and that kind of helped, but not really, because it would also squawk around just like whenever there would be
Literally
crystals.
anything.
Yeah, so it's just going off the whole time, you know.
Constantly.
And so like
Constantly.
that wasn't helpful. The you know the thing that I do love, one of my favorite aspects of this game is the memory shards
Memory shards. Yeah.
system. This is such a cool, innovative thing where it takes that moment, which happens in every Metroidvania, where you see something that you know you can't access yet, but you will be able to later. And it has incorporated this very neat system where you just hold down on the D-pad, it takes a screenshot of that area and just pins it on your map. And you can see exactly where it is. You can go back to it and you know exactly what it is you're looking for and what you're looking at. That, like, when I was like, that should be standard in every Metroidvania from now on, in my opinion. I think that is so smart and so well done.
The game does a few things to try to help you with that 100% completion. Whenever
Hmm.
you highlight a part of the map, it will say in the top left of the map,
Yeah.
how many Xerxes coins, how many lore collectibles or whatever you have. In addition to that, You've got those little indicators that you can talk about, like the parrot that's constantly squawking their head off. There's a few ways that the game does try to help. And in addition to the memory shards thing, you can still put markers. Most
Yeah.
modern games that have a map functionality do allow you to slap markers down essentially wherever you want. And I saw a lot of this that was on the map already, and I was like, I don't need these memory shards thing. I was like, it's a cool idea, but I see how many collectibles I have in each area. I've got the markers already. I don't need these memory shards. And sure enough, like 5 separate times throughout the course of the game, I tried to go back to an area that I knew I hadn't finished yet, that I hadn't specifically put a little memory shard photo there. And I go back to that area, and it turns out that I still didn't have the power or ability or whatever needed to do that. And I was like, well, idiot, that would have been a lot easier to know if you'd had a memory shard photo there.
Yeah.
So
I used it constantly. I love it. I think it's such a
yeah.
cool idea. And like I get it because it is new, so it could be hard to sort of like, you played so many Metroidvanias at this point. It can be hard to like retrain a new thing like that into your sort of Rolodex of like how you sort of parse a Metroidvania, because that changes things. And I love that. Like that was when they introduced that early in the game, and I was like, wow, man, like how has nobody done I mean, Disney Illusion Island has something that is a little like this, but not really, and like otherwise, I've never seen something like that in a Metroidvania. How has it taken us this long with a Prince of Persia game to come up with this idea? I think it's brilliant, and like they make it there is a limitation to it. There is a
you
sort
only
of
have so many times that you can do it. Yeah.
and you can upgrade it, you can get more, and I assume it's because that could potentially create a thing where you can just load up the map, and I'm sure they don't want you doing that. But it's also neat because the game has full cloud functionality. So if I had this game on my PS5, whatever, I could do full cross progression. I can have my save in the cloud, play it on my Switch, then pop over to my PS5, and not only does my save I can pick up right where I was, my memory shard pictures are there too. Like, that's so cool. They have made this game like they have really thought of everything in terms of making this like not only accessible for everybody, but like you can play it however and whenever you want. And I just think that's really special and unique. Like they've really broken down a lot of barriers in a genre that maybe has more barriers than any other genre I can point to. So they should be commended for that, I think.
Yeah, I agree. It's part of the Metroidvania formula is that little dose of serotonin as you continue to fill out checklists, as you continue to collect things, as you continue to get more powerful. That's just always been part and parcel with the genre. And I mean, like I said, here is a Metroidvania. It's here too, just like a lot of the other things that you would expect to be in a Metroidvania. But I do appreciate the fact that even though there are several things in the game that are a pain to go back and 100% the map with, that's not something that I did specifically. I think I got to like 93%. I did the vast majority. Like I did all the major stuff. I did all the side quests. I collected all of the sand pots, which lead to something actually really cool, almost kind of God of War-esque, if you know what I'm referencing.
Yep.
But that was actually really cool. But there's a lot of stuff to really enjoy about the game here from a combat perspective, from a platforming perspective. I really liked a lot of the challenging platforming sections. Most of them were just long enough to keep from getting like too annoying. My biggest problem with that is so many of them were built into just the regular tunnels and pathways that you'll wind up traversing over the map. And I do wish that a few more of them had been a little bit more self-contained, because once you get to the end and once you're just trying to 100%, or when you just want to get to another side of the map, because the map is so big that even the fast travel points can be fairly far apart.
Right.
But just trying to navigate the different map, I'm like, do I really got to go through this every time I come back here? But overall, I did like the platforming sections. The puzzles, even though there's not an overabundance of them, I will say just like I had an incredibly positive experience with one of the biomes in this game, there is a set of puzzles in this game that specifically deal with time shenanigans that I thought were incredibly creative and really, really fun to deal with. And honestly, I wish the game had kind of doubled down on that and added a few more like those in. So, again, if we get a sequel, I would love to see more of that specific type of puzzle. And again, I know you know what I'm referencing.
Yeah, no, I love the puzzle solve, because that was kind of my question coming into this. I mean, Metroidvanias don't really have that, not often. Like like actual puzzles like that, like actual, like, go into a room and do a puzzle challenge. There's not that many Metroidvanias that do that. Metroidvanias, the puzzle is usually environmental. It's usually, how do I access this area? If it's sequence breaking, if it's this or that, how do I get to this collectible? How do I defeat this boss? Whatever. I can't think of really any other Metroidvania. I mean, Ori has some stuff like this, but
Yeah.
like going into a room and solving a puzzle, that this game really does, I think, well. Yeah, I would have liked even more of it, but like there was some really cool, that puzzle with the statues, I thought was really cool and neat, where you have to move the statues in a certain order. And
Oh,
you have
yeah,
to,
yeah, 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 yeah.
really neat. Like I was impressed by stuff. There's a story moment where you have to go to these like four separate areas in order to unlock this large like clock. And there's like kind of four like mini puzzles that you have to do to access the clock fully and move on with the main campaign. It really has like captured in a Metroidvania the elements that we've come to love from Prince of Persia, which is platforming, puzzles, and combat. It has all of those bundled into this completely separate genre that Prince of Persia has never really been in before. Because I see a lot of people say, "Oh, Prince of Persia is going back to its roots." Not really. I mean, like, it's 2D, just like the old games are 2D, but the old games are not Metroidvanias. They're 2D cinematic platformers, you know? So to break into this new genre so confidently and to still manage to be a Prince of Persia game and to actually innovate and push things forward, like, yeah, I've got issues with the game, but that to me is what really makes this game stand out. Like that, like, for a franchise, for a genre that has Metroid and Castlevania as the sort of portmanteau, the sort of combination of those words, like Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, for me, does things that like pushes that genre forward more than any of those other two franchises have done in years, including Metroid Dread. I love Metroid Dread, but it's just a really good Metroid game. This game actually makes some bold strokes, and I appreciate it for that. Again, it stumbles from time to time, but I appreciate that it did it, that it actually moved the needle. You know, this team has got, the vast majority of this team worked on games like Rayman Origins and Rayman Legends, and
Yeah.
similarly, those games are wonderful 2D platformers that felt like they really breathed new life into that genre. And I feel like Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown has kind of done the same for Metroidvanias for me.
Yeah, I will say this is a very different, like, this is not the same character or even really same universe as those 2002 games, as the
No.
original. This is, I guess, another branch in the Prince of Persia multiverse, I would assume. But if you've been a fan of the franchise, yeah, a lot of the hallmarks of Prince of Persia are here. You have, of course, the Persian backdrop. You have the time shenanigans that we've come to expect since the early 2000s. You have the acrobatic swordplay. You've got those puzzles, and you've got a lot of the the platforming challenges that you've come to expect. There are several direct references to the 2000s trilogy, The Sands of Time. I specifically love one of the air movement capabilities you have that winds up being kind of a direct reference, and even one of the cinematic finishing moves that you can do on one of the, or on a couple of the low level enemies, that also wind up being kind of a direct reference to those games. So, paying homage, like, this is definitely a very different take on the series. This is an absolutely new direction for Prince of Persia, but they are trying to still be like, we know where we come from.
It still feels like a Prince of Persia game. I mean, like I really have to step back and appreciate how hard that is. you know, like how difficult of a task they had. They had to they have broken into a new genre with the return of a series that we haven't seen anything from in 14 years. A series that has been around for, you know, 3.5 decades, but we haven't seen in like half that time. And they're like, we're coming in with this brand new genre. We're still making it. We're still like heeding to the tenets of what has always made this franchise special, and we're actually still going to like push forward, innovate, and make it a game that anybody can play. Like, check, check, check. Like that to me, like, yeah, like any like little complaint that I can lodge against it, to me, like totally is, you know, sand in the wind, if you want to go there, compared to what the game achieves. You know, like I think that's the real legacy of this game. You know, like I think that this is like the yardstick, design wise anyways, the yardstick that I will hold future Metroidvania games to.
Yeah. At the end of the day, I look at it and I I do have issues with every aspect of the game when it comes to the narrative. Like I said, I think there's too many characters, and I think that some of the narrative beats don't hit as hard as they could have, and there could have been a few more. When it comes to the presentation, I've already talked about the numerous bugs and the fact that it needs a patch, and I don't want to harp on that anymore. But the fact that a couple of the other biomes I thought were I do think a lot of the game is kind of by the numbers when it comes to biome design. When it comes to the soundtrack, we've talked about that, the ho-hum sound design, and the fact that the soundtrack isn't really allowed to even to be appreciated. And when it comes to the gameplay, there are a couple things that I have that I do really wish that, maybe hopefully we can see in the sequel, and a couple frustrations I had. Some of the boss fights may not have landed for me. So like at the end of the day, I still see this as a very good Metroidvania experience. I do like a lot of what is going on here. I am not going to sit here and say that I'm not going to say that the game of the year conversation is already done for me. It was a very good game that I'm very happy that I played, and that I can still recommend to other people despite the issues I had, and despite the little misgivings I have across the board about the entire package. So ultimately, I'm happy I played it. At the end, I was kind of like, I really wish some of those things didn't happen. But it was a game that I enjoyed my time with. And similarly to you, just because of the accessibility options alone, that also does make it a much more recommendable experience for others very easily.
It's the first Metroidvania game, with the exception of maybe Disney Illusion Island before it, that I could recommend to just about anybody, like because of what they've done here. And that is, I think, a small miracle. And it doesn't really cut corners. The game, we mentioned before, the game's actually quite big. You'll actually, like, getting to as close to 100% as I could, it took like 40 hours. It's like a meaty experience. So I think that another unfortunate thing about this game is it's a Ubisoft game, so it's got a lot of that Ubisoft stigma. I mean, not only is it a Metroidvania, which people already, if you remember, even when Metroid Dread came out, people were like, I better pirate Metroid Dread because it's not worth $60, right?
Yeah, that was the thing. Like, Metroid Dread is like, oh, this is a Nintendo $60 game versus God of War 2018 or something like that. Like, Metroidvania is an indie genre.
Right. And so, and I think that that's an unfortunate side effect of the fact that indies have been carrying this torch for so long.
On their back.
Yeah. And so now I think that people are like, oh, well, Metroidvania equals $20 indie game. That's not the case. We should be supportive of these large scale. We want to see more stuff like this.
Absolutely. I want to see more. Like, my misgivings with the game do not mean don't make any more AAA Metroidvanias. More of these, please. Yes, and thank you. Like I've said, I want to see where Sargon's journey goes next. Absolutely. Bring them back.
And on top of that, it's also got the Ubisoft stigma of, well, I'm going to wait until it's on sale in a couple of months. And if that's, and like, that's totally your prerogative, like value propositions, how you spend money, that's not for me to decide. And like, I can't blame anybody for not picking this up day one or whatever, but what I will say is that like the if you are looking for a high quality AAA Metroidvania that yes has a couple of issues, but if you're looking for something like on the level, like if you were looking for your next itch to scratch after something like Metroid Dread, like this can be it.
Oh,
And
absolutely.
is worth your time and money if you are like if you can go there with it. So yeah, I can recommend this to just about anybody.
That being said, we have passed the 3 day grace period, so the deluxe version, frankly, is not worth the money anymore.
That's fair.
What you get from the deluxe version is like an extra skin and that incessantly squawking parrot that we talked about. So
Yeah,
yeah. So don't worry about getting the deluxe version, frankly,
that's fair.
unless you absolutely need to have that skin, which honestly I didn't think was that good in the first place.
It's
There's other
fine.
skins that you can collect, and I used one of those. So
Yeah.
game, yes, deluxe version, pass.
Yeah, I would agree with that. And also like, yeah, the standard version of the game is not full price. The standard version of the game is $49.99. So you know, I see a lot of discourse about that, and I did want to just squash that a little bit here on our show. So, but yeah, let us know in the comments below what you think of the game. We'd love to chat with you about it.
What are your favorite Metroidvanias?
Let us know. This, of course, is a segment from our weekly Nintendo podcast that we do every single week. All in a Nintendo podcast. Links to that are in the video description as well. So definitely check out the podcast. And we've also got a free, friendly, and welcoming Discord community that you are more than welcome to join as well. Links to that are in the video description as well. Of course, like and subscribe before you head out. We appreciate you. For myself, for Eric, this has been our review of Prince of Persia: The Lost Crown, and we're out. Bye-bye.